All right, welcome everyone. My name is Dan Laird. I'm a media and design specialist with Campus Technology Services, and I'm also the administrator for Panopto on campus. So what we're going to do today is talk about Panopto. We're going to start out with how to set up your account with Panopto, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like in Blackboard after you set it up, and then just goes through some of the basics of the recorder and some of the stuff in the back end. We're going to go through just like some of the simple things that have to do with the program. If there's anything else that we'll probably have time at the end if you have any questions beyond what I normally cover. So just let me know if you have any questions as we go through this. I'll share my screen. Okay. Okay, so the first thing that I'll bring your attention to is our Panopto site on the oswego.edu webpage. It's oswego.edu/cts/Panopto. And on here, we have a brief introduction to the service, as well as some links to videos and tutorials about the service. We also have, beyond what's on this first page, this help resources. This has actually last spring breakouts video that I did with the Panopto introduction. So it has a copy of that, and plus some of the more asked questions about Panopto, such as uploading videos, downloading captions, copying or moving videos to other folders, things like that. So there's some tutorials in here that can help you with that as well. So it's a good resource. I update this page frequently, so please take advantage of it. So the first thing you need to do before you can use Panopto is set up an account in there. And if you try to, like some people will use Panopto on their personal computers, on their laptops, and record lectures. And some people will use the podium computers on campus. If you go on campus and you use one of the podium computers, they all have the software pre-installed. If you haven't set up your account yet, it won't let you log in. So this first step is the most important, to make sure that you have an account set up in Panopto so it'll work for you. So how most people do this is going into Blackboard. So I will go into my class. So all the courses in Panopto have a folder called class recordings. By default, all new courses have this link already in there, so you don't need to create it. You click on that. This isn't what you're going to see, actually. You're redirecting me. So this is what you're going to see after setup. I'm just showing you where the link is. I'm going to show you the short video that I made, because if I've already set up my account, so I can't go back and do it again. I have to go through this short video because it has all the screenshots that I need to show you. So, and this video is on that page that I sent you in case you need to go back to it. So first thing you need to do is go and click on class recordings. And then after you do that, it'll have a configure button. So you go and click on that. Then it'll ask you to add the course to Panopto. So you click on that button. And now your account is active. So that's all you need to do. And after you do that, you'll have this set up. You won't see, this has a bunch of my videos and folders, so it'll be empty when you go in here. But what this step does, it creates the account for you in Panopto, and it also creates viewer access for all the students that are currently registered for this course. So it's two important steps: giving you access and giving your students access to the materials that you're going to be putting in here. So those two things need to be done That's what happens when you create your account, and that needs to be done in order for you to proceed, using Panopto. So after you have set up access to Panopto in your Blackboard course, there's this green create button. You click on that, and there's a Panopto for Windows. There'll also be a Panopto for Mac. It depends on, what computer you're using. But you click on this, and if you don't already have the program installed, you can pick the installer for the Mac or for Windows, depending on what computer you're using, and you can install it. And after you choose that and install it, you can come back in here, and after you're done, click create again, and then you can launch Panopto. And what that's going to do is open Panopto, already have you logged into it, and automatically select this course for you to be uploading your content to. So you can set up Panopto to record to multiple courses. If you're teaching more than one course in a semester, you can set up a folder for every course. So when you go in here, and I think I'm going to have to change my share so you can see my Panopto window. Okay, so this is the Panopto Recorder. This is what you've just installed. You can see right here under folder, it automatically chose the practice course that I was in. So this will automatically select the course that you were in, so that when you create a video for this course, it goes into the correct folder. If you have other classes that you've set up for Panopto, you can click on this pull down, and it'll show you the other folders for the other courses that you've installed. I have admin access, so all the courses show up in here. So you won't see that many. So, so that's the setup with Panopto, and that's the installation of the Panopto recorder. Does anybody have any questions before I get into the recorder?
Yes. Do you have to use Blackboard to use Panopto?
No.
Okay.
It's harder to use if you don't use Blackboard, because if you don't use Blackboard, I can set up an account for you manually, but then all your videos in Panopto have to be public, because you're not setting up it. You're not able to take the course roster from Blackboard and give those students permission. So you manually have to do the permissions for all the videos.
Okay.
So that's kind of why we go ahead.
I'm going to log off then, because I only started last year, and knowing there was a new platform coming, I just didn't bother to set up last year in Blackboard. So I'm waiting for D2L. So please don't be offended. I'm going to hit
No,
the
it's
road.
good. No, you can come to a future class.
I will. Thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Hey, Dan, I have a quick question.
Sure.
Do you need to, sorry for my voice, I'm not feeling well, but do you need to activate the Panopto in each course, or if you do it in one, it should be activated for all of the courses?
You have to do it for each one, because when you go to that configure button, it's making a folder for that course, so that each course you can keep your recording separate for each one, so they're not in one big folder. So
okay, great, thank you.
And Dan, you have to do that every semester too, right? For every course?
Yes.
Okay.
If you set it up in one course, just as an example, if you set it up in one course and say for whatever reason you went into one of your classes on campus and you forgot to set it up in the course that you're teaching, you can always record that session to your other course, grab the video, and then later on move it to another folder. So sometimes people accidentally put them in the wrong folders, and you can move them around fairly easily. So if you do, perhaps forget to activate it for a course, it's not a huge deal if you want to use the system and then upload your content to a different folder later on. So just in case you get stuck in that scenario. Okay. Okay, I'm going to move on with the recorder, which is what I'm sharing with you right now. Usually, by default, there's quite a few settings in here. Normally, you're just going to use the default settings that are already checked off, so you don't need to worry about changing much of this. I'm going to tell you a few things to note while you're in here to make sure that it's working correctly. The first thing is the microphone. Many of you have used Zoom and other things that kind of show levels from the microphone. Just make sure that this is registering. You can see it moving up and down as I'm talking, but just make sure that that's working, because that you need to have audio at a bare minimum for this to have anything recorded. So you just want to make sure that the audio is working first off. Second off, there's video. That's going to be a recording of you. And right now we're using Zoom. So my computer's not able to, if I click on this, it's going to give me an error because Zoom is currently using my camera. You can't have two programs using the camera at the same time. So, but normally that will automatically be selected. That's why it's not right now, because Zoom is using my camera. If for whatever reason you don't want to have yourself in the video, that's perfectly fine. Some people choose not to. By default, this will record your screen and anything that's on it. So if you're presenting a PowerPoint or in Google Slides or anything else, if you're just going to go through a web browser or use a program that you use with the class, if you're going to be doing a YouTube video, anything that you have on your screen is going to be recorded. So, and that's usually the meat and potatoes of what you want your students to see anyway. So some people just don't choose to have themselves talking with it. So you can make that option. You can choose none for video if you don't want yourself recorded. And there's this checkbox here to capture computer audio. You should make sure that that's selected, because if you do have anything like a YouTube video or any audio clips of any sort, you're going to want it to capture the computer audio rather than having it recapture it coming out of your speakers and being recorded into the microphone, because the quality of that is never really good. So you'll want to make sure that that's selected. But other than that, you can click this to see, this gives you a preview of what is on the screen and what will be captured. So if you just want to see what it looks like and what is going to be recorded, you can do that. And if you'd like to change the name, by default, it gives you a timestamp of when the recorder was started. If you want it to be some, professors will use the chapter of the book that they're using class. They'll have, chapter 2 and whatever topic it is, so that when students see the links, they'll have these titles on them and they can more easily kind of go through them. So some people can or do adjust it to whatever content they're teaching. So, and that's usually about it with this. The only other thing, if you use a document camera on campus, with some of these, if you're someone that uses the whiteboard or the chalkboard in the front of the class, it doesn't really capture it that well with the cameras that we have installed. It's a better idea if you're going to be doing any sort of writing like that to do it with a document camera. There's usually another video source under these secondary sources, and you can choose that to record. So if you're in a classroom and you are going to be using a document camera and you need any help with that, just let me know and I could show you how that works. But the secondary sources, the document cameras in the classrooms on campus, they'll be listed in there, and you can choose them and have them record that as well. So the students would see, in that case, the students would see you if you decided to have the video of yourself being recorded. It'll also show whatever's being recorded on the screen. And then there'll be a secondary camera feed that they can select that will show, whatever you're writing underneath the document camera. So that's everything with this as far as pre-recording setup. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? No? Okay. So once you've got everything how you want it, click record. And it'll start recording. Once it does this, you can click the minimize button, go into your PowerPoint, go into the browser or whatever you're going to talk about during your lecture. And then once you're concluded your lecture, you hit stop. You'll get this prompt that says the recording's complete. I think in here, if you want to, you can change the name of this. Let's see. In case you change your mind and wanted to change something in it at the last minute, you can add a description. If you're not happy with it, like say this is something that you're recording to supplement your course, like some extra material, and you're not happy with the recording and you want to delete it and start again, you can click the delete and record again. If you're in the classroom, this typically isn't what you're going to choose. You're just going to take what you've got and click done. Then you'll be sent to the managed recordings. It's going to have, it happened really quick because it was a short video. There's a progress bar that shows your upload status. So after this is done, it uploads your recording automatically into Panopto. And you can see it's saying processing right now underneath status. So your video gets sent up to the Panopto server, the video gets processed, and then once the processing is done, the video will be available for viewing, and then a link will be put into that Panopto folder in your Blackboard course. Your students will then be able to go and check out the lecture that you gave earlier that day. So normally, if like say you have an hour class, it will normally take about 10 minutes for the upload process to complete, if that. It depends on, you know, how many people are on campus and the network and those sorts of variables, but 5 to 10 minutes for the upload to complete. Make sure, you know, when you're done with your class, you can close out of this. You can close Panopto. You don't have to have it open for it to upload because there's a service in the background that will upload it. But don't shut the computer off, because if you shut the computer off, it doesn't matter what's running in the background because the computer is not running anymore and it will cut off your download. So you can log off. So you can stop this, log out of your account, and it will continue to upload in the background as long as you don't shut off the computer. So that's very important. So for an hour class, like I said, 5 to 10 minutes, and then maybe another 5 to 10 minutes for it to process on the server. You'll get an email as well. It says, hey, your session that you just uploaded is available to view. And in the email, you can click on view. You can also edit it from there, and or you can open the editor from there. So that's kind of convenient. Any questions before I move back into Blackboard and show you what it looks like? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing the chat window. Okay, good. Let me go back to the other window. Okay. So once you spend some time in here, you'll see that you'll get the videos will upload and the links will show up in here. This was the one I just recorded, and I have a typo. It's not Winty, it's Winter. So I'm going to go in here, and this is how you change your title after the fact. So there we go. So in here, you can do a number of things. You can go into settings, and you can edit what folder this is in. So like I said, if you put it in the wrong folder, you can click on this and say, hey, this was supposed to go somewhere else. And put it in my folder or wherever. So You can do that in here. You also have the ability to share this outside of Panopto. So say you have a lecture and you want to share it on a web page or with a colleague or with, you know, anywhere outside of what you normally would do with Blackboard. You can go in here and you can put in emails. You can grab the link to it. You can embed it into a web page. You can, if you don't care if other people have access to this, you can change the access for the video. So you can have it so that only people in your organization can see it. You can have it public. There's two different types of public. There is one where anybody that has the link can view it, but it's not listed, meaning that search engines won't aggregate it and it won't be available to search for. And then there's the public, and that's where it automatically is searchable and anybody can still get to it, but it's more public. It's more public if you do public, the public, not the unlisted option. So some people do that. We do have people that use their content in other LMSs that will make them public just so they can grab that link, put it into their content and their modules in the other LMS because it's just easier that way, and they don't really care who has access to the videos of them talking in class. So that is an option. In the outputs in this menu, you can also download your content from Panopto. There is a download podcast option, which is just downloading the video. Podcast is another name for it. So in this window, you can see that my screen is in the background and there's a little square down in here. So it's picture in picture. So if I was recording myself talking during this, it would be in this little window down in the corner. So you can download this. It'll have an MP4 of the video and you can repurpose it outside of Panopto. It will reside on your hard drive. You can put it in other places. So you can also download the audio of these as well underneath this audio podcast option. And you can also change the way this video looks that you're downloading. If you just wanted the screen capture and not you talking, you can take that little window out. So you can change how it looks. Okay. You can also put quizzes in these. I have not done that and don't have much experience with that. John, did you ever use that?
Yes, I have. You're limited to one question, though, in a video, which makes it a little bit challenging. Okay. But it does have that ability. If you want to put in a little, if you want to record a video and then have students ask a question, the score will go directly into Blackboard. It creates a column in the Blackboard gradebook.
Okay, thanks. I should probably know more about that. So in here, it shows you the different audio and video feeds that go into the session. So if you did have a recording of yourself, there would be an entry for another video. And if you had like your document camera, there would be another listing for that as well. And if you have any files in here, like if you used any PDFs or PowerPoints, this automatically saves those and puts them into the session so that students can view them. So there's Smart Search, which we'll go over. Captioning. So this is kind of cool. Anything that you upload and create in Panopto automatically gets captioned. It's machine captioned, but it does a fairly good job. It's not too bad. I'll show you what it looks like and how you can edit those. So if someone is asking for captions and you want to create those for your course, this is an easy way to do that and go in and edit them so they're acceptable levels of accuracy. So, and something else. there's something, there's retention policy. I don't think you need to worry about that. An overview, actually, this is what I wanted to discuss with you. Say you recorded something and for whatever reason, like maybe you wanted to record your content for your course prior to the semester starting and you don't want your students to be able to see this content until a certain period of time, like when they get to this chapter. You can put dates on when these become available. By default, everything immediately becomes available once you upload it. If you want to change that, you can do that. But if you want to do it on a per video basis, you can go in here under availability and say, I want my students to be able to see this on the 31st. And then you can also have it become unavailable again at a certain period of time if you would want to do that. By default, it has the filter settings, which by default is forever. There's no dates on these normally. So those are some of the options in the folder that you can do with the videos. Let's see. If you would like to edit the videos, there's a very simple editor that loads with this that you can kind of cut and paste a little bit. I'll show you how that works. It's nothing too complicated or fancy. So this is the timeline of your video. So you can see there's an audio track and the video track. If, say, you started your video early in your class and you had a conversation with a student prior to starting your lecture and you didn't want that to be on the final recording, there's an easy way to edit that. You can grab the timeline at the beginning and then drag it. And what that'll do is it'll make this part unavailable. Any of these changes that you make aren't permanent when you cut it. It's called a non-destruct edit. So what you're doing is you're just making it so people can't see it publicly. But if you wanted to come back and change this for whatever reason, you can. So you can move this around to take out the first couple seconds. And if you decide to change your mind and make it available later on, you can come in and just take this same line and move it back. So the same can be done with the end of the video. Say you concluded a lecture and you had a conversation with a student after class that you didn't realize was recorded and you want that clipped, you can take this bar at the end and move that as well. And then if, say, there's a part in the middle that maybe you got interrupted with a phone call during class, or for whatever reason you want to take out 10 seconds in the middle of your video, you click on this and then you can, I think I just did the video there. You can cut out certain portions of it. So that's really the basics of what you can do with this. It's not super, there's not a lot of options with it, but if you want to be able to cut portions out so that they're not viewable to the students, you can do that, or anybody that has access to this video. So you can also edit the captions that are created. This is where you go to do so, to look at the captions that were automatically generated up here at the top left-hand corner. You can see this is what it thinks I said. So let's see how accurate that was. So actually this is accurate, so I don't need to make changes, but say if I wanted to, just go in here and make the change that I want to the text and hit enter. And that's all I need to do. So it's very easy to edit the captions in this. So, and then once I'm done making whatever changes I want to make, I click apply. And it'll say the changes haven't been applied. that I made. Do I want to close the editor? Sure. And that'll bring me back to the video. So that's a quick overview of the editor. Does anybody have any questions before I kind of wrap this up and show you some other things? There's not much left to go over. The folder options. So these options down below are obviously on each video, but if you wanted to apply settings to the entire folder, up at the top here, there's this little gear. That's for the folder settings. So as I was telling you before, you can, I'm sorry, settings. Okay. So under settings is where you can have it, the session availability. You can have it so that if you didn't want your sessions immediately available, you can click never. So when you upload these, they aren't automatically posted. They're in your folder, but they're not, the links aren't posted into Blackboard public, well, not publicly, for your students to see. So that way you can kind of, if you wanted to have each one have their own release time, you could do that. So, or if you had all your videos ready to go and say, I just want them to be able to see it on the first day of the semester and you want to apply it to all your videos, then you could set a start date in here, and that would apply to all the videos in this folder. So you wouldn't have to do it on each individual one. So, but again, by default, sessions become available immediately upon you uploading them. So if you want to change that, you got to come in here and do that. Okay, and you can also have analytics. You can see the views on each of these, and you can see who's viewed them. So if you have a student that says they've been, you know, if they're having difficulty and they've said they've been viewing these and you want to see if they're telling the truth, you can come in here and look at the viewers. It should only be me, I believe. Oh, you download the reports, that's right. So you can download those reports. Yeah, here it is. So you can look at each one. You can see how long people have watched your video, which this can be kind of useful if you have a video that's getting a lot of engagement, a lot of people viewing it. You can kind of go in here and see if there's a certain spot that people are going to, like maybe there's a topic that students are having difficulty with or really honing in on, you'll see a spike in views. So that can be useful. And then we'll have the viewer down here. It will show them how many times show you how many times they viewed it, how many minutes they've watched it, and how much of the video they've watched. So those are some of the analytics you can look at. You can look at it per video. You can also look at your entire folder together. So. Okay. Let's see, is there anything else I need to show you? If you want to create folders, say you want to organize by book or by chapter, or if you have different topics that you'd like to cover and you want to organize those, you can click add folder and put whatever subject it is. And then you can take these and you can say, I want to take this winter breakout session and put it in the winter breakout folder. I can, no, that's not what I wanted to do. click edit. I can change what folder I want them to be in. I can also click on this and click. I don't know if I can drag and drop. I've done that before. Oh, look at that. You can drag and drop it. That's a lot easier. Okay. So I think that about covers everything with the basics of Panopto. Did anybody have any other questions? No, it's a lot to cover. There's quite a few options with this. You can be as simple of a product as you want it to be, or you can get into the weeds and really tinker with it if you want to. So, okay. Well, if there's, if anybody has questions, feel free to contact me, daniel.laird@oswego.edu. You can also, if I'm not around, contact the help desk and they can create a ticket for me and I'll address it. So either way, I'd be happy to help. So, thanks for coming today.
Thanks, Dan.
No problem.
Thank you, Dan.
Yep. Hope you all have a good weekend.
You too.